Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about travel and transformation. It's one of my more favorite presentations, so I'm really excited to dive into the topic today. Um, it's important from a personal standpoint, but also from a societal and cultural impact. So I really hope that if you come across this video today, that you stay and watch the whole thing because it's an important responsibility that we have when we transform ourselves, that we get to when we share our transformations from our travel experiences and our spaces that we do so really responsibly and with care and love for the cultures that we've had the privilege of being transformed by. So let's dive right in. I'm excited to share this presentation with you today, Travel and Transformation. If you're new here, I'm Katie, and I help solopreneurs with their space. I have about 17 years or so experience with interior design and over 10 years of personal development experience. I've blended the two to powerfully help people align their goals with their physical space so they can strategize and more easily and effectively and with more fun and joy be able to accomplish their goals and desires. So if that's you and you happen to also be maybe sensitive, ADHD, neurodivergent, fall into one of those categories, you are absolutely in the right place. Gosh, even more so if you consider yourself spiritual, a retreat leader, something to that effect, like sit right down. You are in the right place. Okay, travel and transformation. Oh, I still have this typo. Sorry. It's like when you go through, when you go through a presentation, you think you've edited everything, and it's like not quite, not quite. I just finished a book recently. Oh, and I thought I was done. I bought 30 copies and I get it in and realized it still had some tweaks being used. Darn it, I should have checked, excuse me, that sample copy a little bit closer. Oh well. So we're not talking about the senses per se in this particular slide. Please ignore that headline. Instead, let's talk about what travel does for the soul, what draws us there. So, yeah, what does travel do for us? Why do we seek it out, and why does it seem so good with the soul, right? We're going to be talking about a little bit of what you're left with when you come back from travel, ways to bring it into your space, and examples of how people have brought their travels or cultural experiences into their artwork, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And we can argue what successful means. I'm arguing that successful in this particular case is actually having to do with appreciating versus appropriating. And we're going to talk about the differences between the two. We're going to talk a little bit about design stewardship and responsibility as well. So stay tuned for that. Okay. So what travel does for the soul? Oftentimes we're seeking out an escape or much needed body, mind, or soul rest, rejuvenation, so we can jump back into all the things we love doing, and etc. Oftentimes we go to travel, we're desiring for change. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie Eat, Pray, Love. If you're here, you probably have. And if you're like me, more than once. Fabulous movie. And book. An author. She's really cool too. So desire for change, desire to shake things up, right? Desire for a specific type of outcome or experience, etc., that doesn't exist in the current environment, and shaking things up, as I kind of indicated before. Yeah, just to do something different. So it's like you're desiring change, you're desiring a transformation. Somewhere in you, you know things you want to be different. And what you're left with. Oftentimes, I would argue almost always you're left with a transformation, a slightly or not so slightly new version of you. You're often left with inspiration, ahas, a feeling of what's next. How can I, take these changes that I've experienced and infuse them into my life, my creativity, my projects, my relationships. You might come across additional questions and further interest in a particular topic. You might have visited an area and say, I really want to research that area of Bali that I hung out with and that I hung out in, and what's the history and what's the you know, what are some more specifics on some of the areas that I hung out in during my trips? And again, you might find some changing environments, and that could include your family, friends, work, hobbies. When you transform yourself, everything around you changes as well. And often a rested and grounded outlook too, hopefully. That's not always the case depending on what kind of travel you're doing, but hopefully you've got a more rested and grounded outlook too, whether you went for rest or not. Okay, so let's talk about some ways to bring it into your space. Colors, patterns, textiles. You might find that a particular region that you visited has like some common color palettes that they use, and you want to like bring that into your space. Some lighting or glazing choices. When I say glazing, I mean like windows, or you might find there's like some stained glass element or something like that. Some glazing choices. It might be structural, sculptures, figures, iconography, shapes, and even space configurations too. You might be completely inspired to change up the layout of your space, or a layout within a space, even that you've considered. Some layout and planning choices. Here are some examples. We talk about appreciating and not appropriating culture. And some of these are design, like interior design specific, and some of them are art based. So just know that. So when I talk about the success or non-success, a lot of these are all celebrated artworks. Okay, I'm not trying to trash the artists and say that they weren't successful with their work. I think they often were. As a former art history major, by the way, and by the way, I know a lot of people say not to have majors like that in college, but it was one of the best things I've ever done. So if you are trying to go back to school for something you really, really love or have an appreciation for, don't let anyone knock you off that path if it's something that you're really interested in. Okay. So yeah, as a former art history major, college, undergrad, and I got my master's in interior design, if you're curious to know about that. There are some artists that have more successfully appreciated art and culture that they've experienced on their travels, both locally and abroad. And there's some who have done more appropriation. They've been more exploitative with their artwork. And as celebrated as those artworks are, they are also problematic. So let's talk about those ones that did it incorrectly versus those who did it correctly. So some artists and designers who appropriated techniques and design styles. They didn't credit their sources, and sometimes they even exploited the local population for various things. You can, if you want to know more about that, I would encourage you to look those up. Our Pablo Picasso, he incorporated African mask aesthetics without attribution, problematic. Paul Gauguin, he exoticized and exploited Polynesian cultural imagery, people, and vulnerable girls. So also problematic. And so artists and designers, and by the way, what do those two artists have in common? They happen to be men of European descent. And so I think in the context of this, and not to excuse any of that at all, oftentimes we find people who are perpetrating this kind of attribution and appropriation don't have the empathy or context with which to make better decisions. And so that's why we need to call it forth. Excuse me. Because I don't, obviously these people they existed before my time. I don't know them. Were they aware what they were doing was bad? Maybe. Whether they were or not, what might have been helpful to prevent some of the terrible things that had happened and maybe guided that into a better direction would be to have people around them letting them know that what they were doing was exploitative and not okay. And hey, Pablo, you want to, do this kind of artwork, you need to get permission. You need to maybe collaborate with local artists in Africa. and include them in this conversation, include them in this artwork, right? That didn't happen. And so this is why it's up to those of us around to speak up when we see injustices, when we see appropriation, not from a place of, you know, blaming or shaming people necessarily, but from a place of correction and re-steering this ship. So, because it still happens today. It obviously happens a lot more in, historical context, but it still happens today in various different ways. So, Paul Gauguin, I would argue, was even more problematic because not only did he exoticize and exploit Polynesian cultural imagery without attribution, he also exploited vulnerable girls in that population, and so that is really sad for those girls and young women. And so again, if Paul had people around him saying, "Yo, don't do that, maybe that's shitty." Also, you need to attribute artists and culture. You need to be inclusive in this conversation and not make it all about you. That would have had I think, much more successful outcome, certainly in how these artworks came to be. And we'd be having as a conversation too, culturally, globally, not just a more responsible conversation, which is clearly important, but also a conversation where we learn so much more from each other when everyone is included in these ways. So it really does an injustice to everyone, certainly the vulnerable populations and the populations who are not properly attributed, but also globally, based on what people aren't learning due to the lack of inclusivity. So those guys, they've been successful as far as, notoriety and beautiful artwork and this and that, but I would argue they've been very unsuccessful, those two, having, appropriated these works, which is really unfortunate. But let's talk about the flip side of that. Let's talk about some artists and designers who leaned way more on the appreciative side of things when it comes to artwork and cultural, inclusivity. Isamu Noguchi, okay, consciously hybridized Japanese and Western design, acknowledging both. You may or may not be familiar with the Noguchi table, okay? That is in the lower corner here. It's a famous piece of design work that you can still buy today because it's got such a unique history and art form, and it's just a really cool piece of design to have in your home. And so he consciously hybridized Japanese and Western design, acknowledging both. Okay, so that was properly done. Frida Kahlo drew from indigenous Mexican iconography as cultural reclamation. Okay, and she does this throughout her work, and she does it really responsibly. So, and what's the difference between these two people versus the two individuals we spoke about at the beginning of the slide? They're both people of color. They had some context, they had some experience, they had some cultural empathy. And so the probable outcome is that when they approached their artwork, they had a context with which to be responsible and kind and inclusive. So this is why education is so important. And I'll go back to my art history degree. I don't think everyone needs to get an art history degree to be successful in these kinds of things, but this is why historical education is important. This is why art history is important, because it can really be harmful to cultures, and we want to avoid that. We also want to create a much larger and fun and expansive and educational dialogue with which to work cross-culturally. So especially for people like white folks, people of European descent, who don't have this lived experience sometimes, or this cultural framework with which to work and understand what could be harmful. We really need education to teach people how to be in the world. And so in this current regime, I'm personally seeing a lot of rollback of education of all kinds, but certainly cultural art, etc. I think this is a huge problem, and I'm here to call it out today as part of this presentation. If you have the means to advocate for proper historical and art historical education for folks, I really recommend that you do so, because we lose so much culturally when we do. And actually, there has been some really interesting times over history where nations used art to connect cross-culturally with other nations, to bring people closer together, to realize that we all have our beautiful nuances and practices and differences, but we also have we have so many of the same things going on. We all have our humanity. We all look at the same stars every night. And art really has the power to bring people together. So that is my wish. That is my wish. So, in summary, one thing we need to do when we bring items into our home from travels is to create a context with which to understand them better and to credit artists and such. We need to appreciate and not appropriate. If you picked up a beautiful, like, Balinese, like, let's say you went to Bali, let's say you went to Europe, let's say you went to wherever it was that you went. If you have a sculpture or an icon or something that you want to place in your space, I'd recommend placing it in your space with some kind of context, some kind of caption, so that people don't just see it coming into your space and assume that you could have gotten it from anywhere, or that the origins aren't important. The origins are important to the cultural conversation. And also, you're educating people when they come into your space and they see stuff like that. Oh, I got this from here. It was made by such and such. This is what it means. This is its importance. This is its history. And what a cool conversation that you also get to have with someone as a result of being responsibly sharing that item. Okay. It encourages further conversation and awareness, for sure. As I just mentioned, right? We're sharing these conversations, and we're connecting dots and creating connections across the globe. Design activism, right? So to me, we can execute progressive activism through art. And so when you bring items home from a travel experience, you have the opportunity to spread that joy and knowledge and education through your space. And then it can infuse all kinds of aspects of your life as well. So I believe these things trickle through aspects of our lives, and it turns into design activism. It deepens the journey, certainly deepens who you are as an individual, and can often deepen relationships and transform those too. It also invites our friends in for the fun and creates future inspiration. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this quote by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you are ever a Lord of the Rings fan, books or movies, he's the guy. And the quote is, "Not all those who wander are lost." And I love that quote because it speaks to the human spirit of seeking adventure and seeking change and seeking to travel. This is another different quote and poem, but seeking to travel the road less traveled, right? So wandering can be a beautiful thing. And sometimes it can also be a beautiful thing to get a little lost sometimes. So with that, maybe consider doing something today or this week outside the norm. Maybe, follow something that brings you joy that you wouldn't normally do. Certainly something, safe, not telling you to go on some like crazy dangerous adventure, but follow some unexpected joy here, and let me know in the comments what comes up for you. Okay, I hope that was a really helpful presentation. I got to share a little bit of my art history background here, just a tiny snippet, but the more important thing not being the specifics, but the context with which to um, approach multiculturalism and be responsible and kind and inclusive um, and just have a deeper connection around it. And I hope that's helpful. Okay, have a good one. We'll see you next time.